Hello and welcome to Libre Connect. I'm Azmina Govinji, a dietitian and nutritionist. I was chief dietitian to Diabetes UK for 8 years, so tonight's topic is really close to my heart. I'm delighted to be your host for this Freestyle Libre event this evening. Now, we're going to be exploring all things food in the context of diabetes management. And what we want to do is to create a really safe space to address any of your food-related challenges. We'll offer practical and manageable solutions, and we'll help you rediscover the joy of food through small but impactful dietary changes. Food has such a significant impact on our lives, doesn't it? It's fuel for our bodies. But more than that, it affects your mental health, your mood, your immune system, even your energy levels. And it can be festive and social, and it can bring people together. So today what we want to do is to celebrate that joy of food and acknowledge its importance. Now, we've got 3 sections lined up for you tonight. Firstly, we're going to focus on understanding the impact of different foods on your blood glucose levels. Next, we'll discuss the role of food in diabetes management more broadly. And finally, we're going to be debunking some of those common food myths. And within that section, we'll be showing you different types of foods, giving practical tips on food swaps to help keep your blood glucose levels in range while still keeping that love of food alive. So with us for the next hour, I have a fantastic panel. Firstly, Mark Green. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you.
Mark is an advanced specialist dietitian in diabetes. We also have Johnny Bailey. Hi, Johnny.
Hello.
Johnny is a Freestyle Libre ambassador, and he lives with type 1 diabetes. So that's going to be really insightful. And of course, the lovely Jenny Bolton. Welcome.
Hello.
Jenny has type 2 diabetes, so it's really interesting that we've got different perspectives here. And of course, we'll be joined by all of you, our amazing audience. Throughout today's show, we want to hear from you. Please feel free to submit your questions in the question tab to the right of your screen. And we'll do our best to answer as many as we can during our Q&A sessions. Finally, just a quick reminder that we can't answer individual medical or product-specific questions. And as always, please keep things polite in the chat section. So welcome to section 1, and this is about understanding the glycemic impact of foods. And to kick things off, we're going to sort of look into how foods impact our blood glucose levels. It's what we dietitians call glycemic impact. And it means understanding a concept called glycemic index, which you might have heard about, often abbreviated to GI, and glycemic load, or GL. So I'm going to come to you, Mark, as our in-house expert, to sort of give us a bit of science to start with. So tell us, what is GI, and why is that important in diabetes?
So essentially, GI is a measure of how quickly carbohydrate-containing foods, which are the ones that affect glucose levels, impact your glucose levels, or how quickly are they absorbed into your body. And then we can rank these. So you have high GI, medium GI, low GI. So naturally, the high GI foods have more potential to cause a spike in those glucose levels because you're getting more glucose being absorbed in one instant compared to low GI, where you have less glucose being absorbed in one moment. So I think a nice way to think about it, although it's a bit of an exaggeration, is high GI is more like a waterfall, and your body can struggle to keep up with that at times. Whereas low GI is a bit more like the drip effect, and so your body's more easily able to deal with those glucose rises.
That's a lovely way to look at it, actually. I'm going to borrow that one. But I think essentially that's how I would see it, in that the low GI foods are those that help your blood glucose to go up slowly and down slowly. Mm-hmm. And you want to be having more of your diet based on those low GI foods.
Exactly.
And fewer of those ones that give you the spike, such as sugar in a liquid form.
Exactly. Yeah. And your white carbs and anything that you're manipulating, like mashing, etc. I mean, I don't want to step on the guy's toes, so
I'm sure we'll get into that.
Yeah.
That's really interesting, and we will make sure to talk about that. So that's glycemic index, and it's a ranking, but you don't need to know the numbers. I know people have said, oh, what number is bread and what now? You don't really need to know. I love the way you explained it in terms of the type of food. Mm-hmm. So we've got glycemic index. What about the other one, glycemic load?
Well, glycemic load's probably the missing big brother. It's actually my preferred measure. So glycemic index will only take you so far. It's important, but it can only take you so far. And let me explain. So, for example, if you look at watermelon's high GI. Chocolate is actually kind of medium GI. So if you were following strictly a low GI diet, you could actually eat a lot more chocolate than you could watermelon. Sounds great. but we know logically the chocolate's going to cause a bigger spike in glucose levels. And that's because the fat in the chocolate slows down the absorption. So glycemic load considers the amount of carbohydrate in that food. So it considers the amount of carbs, and it also considers how quickly it's absorbed. So what is the load being placed on your bloodstream? So those foods that then are high glycemic load have the biggest potential to cause glucose rises if you're susceptible to having glucose rises in the first place, because everyone will be different. And when we do that, it starts to look a lot more like we'd expect. So those foods that generally get the sort of bad labels in diabetes, the sugary foods, will be the high glycemic load, and the foods that are low glycemic load will be more like your veggies, your fruits, etc.
Right. So the glycemic load almost looks at the portion of food you're eating. And even if you're having low GI foods, if you have too much of them, they're also going to cause those spikes we don't want. So it's about portion awareness, carbohydrate quantity, and how it's going to affect your bloodstream.
Exactly.
Brilliant. You've probably answered this, but just for clarity, why is it important to understand both of these concepts?
Because, well, we often see patients come into clinic and they think they're doing all the right things. They've gone from high GI to low GI, but they're still seeing spikes and they can't quite work out why. So understanding that the portion is probably going to be the dominant factor, and the GI is also going to be a tool in the toolbox that's going to help you along the way. If you can understand it, you can change it. And if you can change it, that's when you're going to start getting the best outcomes.
Right. And that's why dietitians are uniquely placed, aren't they? Because we can help people navigate that.
Yes, and exactly. And you do this enough that you start to get a sort of walking encyclopedia of the carb contents of different foods, and you can get the hierarchy. But, this is widely available information as well. So you don't need a dietitian necessarily to get that information.
Great. And Jenny, I would love to hear what you're hearing here and whether you've sort of looked at the concept of low GI, high GI, or GL. Does that factor in your decision?
I didn't really look into it much at all, but when I knew about this, I did have a quick look. But I have made smaller portions, and I've noticed that. So I suppose that's because of the load that I'm taking on. So I do know that smaller portions has stopped me spiking so much, but I didn't realise that's what it was at the time. But it makes so much sense that now you've explained.
But I think you've cracked it, really. That's it. And you notice what works for you, and that's what's really important here.
It works for me. And not everything that I say today would work for everybody, but that works for me. Smaller portions and leaving off the white.
Great. So you're addressing glycemic load without even realising.
Yeah.
You're natural. Brilliant. What about you, Johnny? Do you find that you use these concepts? Are they familiar to you?
Yeah, so I actually know, I'd researched quite a lot diagnosed about glycemic index, but I didn't realise there was such a big sort of differentiator between glycemic index and glycemic load. So I'm already uncovering many different things about food and glycemic index, glycemic load, and we're only 5 minutes in. So I think this will be a very interesting one.
Great. I think we're all going to learn from each other, actually. I should be taking notes here. I would love to hear a bit more about your journey, Johnny, because I know that you've tried different eating approaches. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I was diagnosed, and I very quick, my mum is such a hypochondriac, so I think I've sort of gotten quite a lot of that from her. So I very quickly delved into glycemic index, glycemic load. It forms quite a big part of the guidance, doesn't it, for diets and diabetes. But I think glycemic index was the thing I was looking at most, and not as much glycemic load. And just hearing you explain it, it makes more sense to me now why obviously chocolate is low on the glycemic index, and I could have a chocolate bar. And I always thought to myself, well, hang on, how does the glycemic index work? Because a watermelon isn't going to spike me as high as a chocolate bar is. And just hearing you explain that's really helped me sort of discover a bit more about that whole glycemic index, glycemic load. But yeah, I was diagnosed, and so I was very keen on understanding a lot more about diet. So over the last 4 years of having it, I've sort of explored different diets, different glycemic loads, I suppose you could say. I've done them all. Vegetarian,
what's worked
meat
for you?
eating. I think any sort of diet is better than your standard diet. I was eating pizzas every night before I was diagnosed, and I sat down with a specialist dietitian when I was diagnosed. She said, "What do you eat?" And I said, oh, pizza and pasta. She said, oh, well, pizza's good because it's got cheese on it and that could help lower the... But I quickly uncovered that eating pizza every night probably wasn't going to be the best for my management. So I've found out, I've tried the whole food diet like Jenny. That worked much better for me. I saw those differences in blood sugar spikes and things. But now I practice a bit more. I'm a bit easier on carbs, but I'm very sensible about when I eat carbs. I don't omit carbs from my diet. I enjoy them still, but I'm just a bit more cautious about when's the right time for me to have those carbs.
So that sounds as though you've become quite an expert on you.
Yeah.
And that's the key here, isn't it, Mark? That, you know, I really feel that you know your body more than, say, an expert might. And that's really interesting that you've heard things like cheese, as we know, is a low GI food, so it's going to reduce that spike. But obviously, cheese is not the best way to keep your diabetes management under control. So that's really fascinating. And I'd love to hear your view on that, Mark. One regarding the sort of different strategies, but also what can we think of beyond GI and GL? You know, some people talk about the order in which we eat, or we know that the way you cook food influences the spikes and how your blood glucose is going to be managed after that. Could you share a bit about that?
Yeah, so if you think about it, the way you're preparing the food, so for example, if you're mashing a potato, the nice way to think about it is you're literally breaking up the starch, so it's more easily absorbed as opposed to a whole potato. I'm not suggesting that you eat a raw potato, but it's going to be lower GI than if you're mashing it up. Same with things that you juice, same with things that you soften. So a lot of breakfast cereals are actually quite low GI in the box, but then when you add the milk, it turns to mush. You almost don't need to chew it by the end of the bowl, and you can see those glucose spikes. So it's understanding these kind of like individual nuances and understanding why your body is or react to what you see in these glucose rises for you, but where one person rises, another won't. So you also need to have that individual approach rather than putting a blanket ban on certain food groups. And, you know, sometimes we also get in this tunnel vision of just thinking about glucose. There's a wider picture here nutritionally. And exactly as Johnny was just saying, you know, pizza, even if it doesn't cause a glucose spike, it's probably not the healthiest thing in the world.
Yeah. And so it's common sense, really, isn't it? And the diet for diabetes is just a healthy diet that we should all be having. So thinking about the feel-good factor of food, I'd love to come back to you, Johnny, in terms of, because you mentioned the pizza, you've mentioned other foods. How do you keep an eye on your management of your blood glucose, but also really have those feel-good foods?
Yeah, so I was diagnosed and quickly I discovered the pasta I was eating every night beforehand wasn't the best for the spikes. I tried whole meal pasta. It did reduce the spike, but I found that the lower glycemic index sort of foods kept me sort of moderately high, nowhere near as high as a high glycemic index would, but kept me moderately high for longer, and it took much longer for me to sort of get back down into range. So I looked at an alternative. I looked at a different pasta, and this was sort of a year. I'd given up pasta for a year just because I couldn't get this spike right. And then I found this alternative, and it's edamame pasta, and it is absolutely delicious. And it's now actually our preferred pasta whenever my family are cooking dishes because it's so scrumptious, and yeah, I don't get that spike at all. And it's amazing. So some alternatives, you know, swapping. There's other pasta alternatives. There's konjac noodles. They're not as nice. But other alternatives can actually taste just as nice, and the spike isn't as noticeable.
Yeah, fascinating. And also how long we cook our pasta for. So if you're having al dente pasta, that's going to cause a slower glucose rise than if you overcook it for 15, 20 minutes or so. That's going to spike. But I'll have to try that edamame pasta. That sounds nice, doesn't it?
Never heard of it.
What about you, Jenny? What sort of foods do you think give you that, bring back the love of food?
I like spicy food. I like curries and anything spicy. And I tend to sort of go with the whole meals and the sweet potatoes and the grain breads and things. And smaller portions. But basically, it's the same sort of foods that I've always eaten, but just swapping certain white pasta for wholemeal pasta, and different sorts of potatoes for ordinary potatoes. But yeah, I tend to eat pretty much the way I've always eaten, but made some swaps to make it work for me.
Great. Fascinating. And that's the key, is enjoy the foods you've always enjoyed. but
Yeah.
Make some common sense changes.
Yeah.
So this is lighting up like a Christmas tree. I've got so many questions from the audience. So thank you firstly. The first one is, I have type 1 diabetes. Is this information still relevant to me? Well, maybe I can just answer that one very quickly. Firstly, we have Johnny here who has type 1 diabetes. So this person's going to be really latching on to your answers. But I guess this is relevant to everyone with diabetes, and you will pick up things that are relevant to you. I promise you, you will. And over to you, Mark. I've got a question here that says, you can eat whatever you want as long as you inject for it. Is this a myth?
Well, I suppose that's probably leaning towards the type 1 again, although people with type 2 also do inject insulin, and I guess it depends on the type of insulin. So again, it's going back to that. We're still recommending healthy eating as a whole, because as I said, there's a wider picture here than just diabetes and glucose. But yes, you can get a good glucose result regardless of what you eat in type 1 diabetes if you're injecting the appropriate insulin and timing it correctly. And vice versa for type 2 diabetes. Like I say, everyone's different. So where one person finds something spikes them, another will find that it doesn't. But ultimately, it's getting back to those basics about portion control, the types of foods that we're eating. You know, there's kind of this narrative that the nutritional guidelines are we're pushing a bunch of sugar and processed carbs down people's throats. That's not the case. We want whole grains. We want vegetables, 5 a day. Part of that message that's missed out is minimum. Lean proteins, and then that allows for the odd naughtier food from time to time, so it keeps you sane, keeps it sustainable, because unfortunately we're in this for life. And so if you want to get the results for life, you have to do it for life.
Yeah. And it's got to be enjoyable, because
And
otherwise you're
enjoyable.
not going to keep to it.
Exactly.
Great. We've got a question about eating white rice for type 2 diabetes. Maybe I can direct that first to yourself, Jenny, and then get Mark's opinion. Because when you mentioned something earlier, you said that you eat rice, but you're careful about it. Say a little bit more about that.
I buy brown rice, but I don't particularly like it. I can never get it to be soft enough. If I go out for a meal and there's rice on the plate, I will push some of it to one side and just eat a smaller portion of it. So I don't deprive myself of it. I just make sure that the portion is more relevant for me, for my glucose levels. And it's all a matter of sort of portion size for me, cutting down portion sizes. But I do still eat it because I don't particularly like the brown rice.
Great answer, because this is exactly what the question's asking. Can I eat it? And you're saying yes, but what's your portion size?
Yeah, just what's your portion size?
Yep, I'd agree with that. And Mark, just sort of the same question, but an addition to that is red rice better than white basmati rice?
Yes, it's got a slightly lower GI. Obviously, it depends how you cook it. So, you know, if you're nuking it, it might have a higher GI because you're breaking down that starch. But yes, slightly lower GI. I guess just latching back onto what Jenny was saying as well, because naturally what people think is when you're reducing portions, am I going to be hungry? Well, you can manipulate the plate as well. If you're losing a little bit of the rice, you can up the vegetables, you can up the protein a little bit. So it doesn't necessarily mean you have to be hungry.
Which is what I do.
But actually, I think when we were talking earlier, Jenny, what you were saying was actually when you made the change, you didn't really notice much difference.
No. It's just, I eat a lot more vegetables, more than my 5 a day.
Good.
and veg and fruit, and that is what I've done. I've replaced a lot of the carbs with fruit, veg, and protein.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Great. Gosh, there are another sort of 6, 7 on here. I will come to you in the next section, Johnny. All right. So let's see where we're moving to now. So for section 2, we're talking about the role of food more broadly in type 2 diabetes management. So the role of food is crucial, but it's also important to keep that love of food alive. And that's really the essence of what today is about. Managing diabetes doesn't mean giving up on your favorite foods. We've heard this already. It means making informed choices that help us enjoy the foods we love while maintaining our health. So in this section, we'll explore how to balance effective diabetes management with a positive relationship with food. So first of all, I'd like to come to you, Mark, in terms of some insights that can help people to keep their blood glucose levels within a healthy range, but still maintain that love of food.
Yeah, and I suppose the first thing I'd say is knowledge is power. So we've already addressed GI, GL. So by all means, read up on that kind of stuff. Their books are available. There's lots of information online. Once you understand it, you can then maybe start to choose foods that you can be confident that they're not going to cause as big a glucose rise. Because, sometimes when you get that glucose rise, it throws you out for the entire day, ruins your day, hate food, hate life.
Okay.
Whereas if you're eating something, you have that confidence that it's not going to do that. Maybe that gives you a bit more enjoyment back into cooking, a bit more enjoyment back into the food choices. Next step on that would be maybe upskill, learn how to cook foods, how to prepare foods, get some recipes. Even if you just research one recipe a month, seems like a long time, but after a year, you've got 12 go-to recipes that that's going to be in your repertoire and allow you to get that enjoyment and have flavoursome food because it needs to taste good.
Great. And I'd like to talk a bit about glucose sensors. Can you give us some insights into the value of a glucose sensor and how that helps you to enjoy those foods?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd be very keen to hear these guys' views as well, because obviously if you can see it in real time, what's actually happening to your glucose levels after you've eaten, that's the most powerful feedback you can get, really. You can read all the textbooks, you can read all the articles online, but ultimately really where it counts is what's happening in real time and how it responds for you. So if you can see that a certain food's causing you a bit of a headache, perhaps you can reduce the portion, perhaps you can swap the food, perhaps you can pair it with some protein or some fat to slow down the absorption. And that way you can start to build kind of your own database about the do's, the don'ts, and the sometimes.
Nice way to put it. And as you've said before, this is our theory and this is what we learn through our patients. But honestly, it's great to have two live people here. You both have a glucose sensor. So I'd be fascinated to hear how you use it, Jenny. How does it help you?
I've only actually been using mine constantly since June. And it's helped me to understand what I'm eating and what is spiking me and my portion sizes, because I can see if I've had a big, crumbs, I shouldn't have had that. And it's gone up. And it's teaching me. And I'm actually cooking more from scratch because I noticed that helps with my glucose levels. Before I had this, I didn't know what was spiking me so much because I didn't finger prick as much as I should have done. And I love the real time. It's absolutely brilliant, and I've lost weight since I've had it. It's really taught me to know my body better and to know what's affecting me better.
That's so empowering. I really like that. So what you've shown me there is, a lot of people think it may be mainly for type 1 diabetes, but what you've shown me there is that it's empowered you.
Yes,
because you've got that real-time feedback.
Yeah.
And as a result, you've started cooking more because you've seen the difference in, let's say, a ready meal, which I'm sure you don't have very many.
No, not now, not anymore.
Well, see how it's helped you to improve your diet generally.
Yeah, and it's taught me, like, I would eat a stir fry before, and I've now learned that if I put a protein with that stir fry, it slows it down. It slows down my glucose spike, and it makes it more even, which I wouldn't have thought of before. Because listening to other people and saying, yeah, I'll try that. And with the sensor, I can see exactly what I'm putting into my body is and what is affecting me, which I couldn't do before.
Sounds liberating. What about you, Johnny? I know you have one. How do you use it?
Yeah, so I've had it since I was actually diagnosed. My nurse is wonderful. I always reference Linda, but Linda gave me the sensor 2 weeks after my diagnosis. So I've had it since it was a flash glucose monitor and you had to scan, and now with the real-time readings, they're brilliant. And like Jenny said, you can see the effect. So I mentioned the edamame pasta before. I didn't know how that was spiking my sugars, and then during the night I can now see from the sensor data that I go high in the night, so I then adjust my management to try and stop that spike. And I think Mark and Jenny have hit it on the head about cooking in the kitchen. Before I was diagnosed, I couldn't boil an egg, and now I absolutely love being in the kitchen, and it really comes across in my levels, I think. So I think cooking from scratch, learning how to cook, is just a brilliant method for improving glucose management.
So you found the sensor to be quite valuable in that respect.
Yes, definitely.
Really interesting. And Mark, maybe I can come to you around the value of it in terms of enjoyment of food. What do your patients say, for example, in terms of how they've managed to enjoy their food a bit more through having that awareness?
Well, exactly that. And I think these guys have hit the nail on the head. It takes the anxiety away. So then they can actually eat confidently and enjoy their food. Literally, I think it's as simple as that. Knowing the proportions or the types of foods that they can be cooking with or even eating out with, then they know that they can enjoy that meal almost risk-free to a certain extent. Whereas before, like Jenny was saying, she wasn't too sure. She wasn't maybe finger pricking as much. Well, I mean, who would finger prick that many times in a day as with the continuous glucose monitors?
That's right.
You've made the transition perfectly, and you've been able to enjoy it, lose some weight, eat healthier, and happier for it by the sounds of it, from a dietary perspective at least.
Definitely, yeah.
And sticking with you then, Jenny, share your favourite food and how you've managed, well, number one, the favourite food, but then how have you navigated enjoying that favourite food while still watching those blood glucose levels?
I love spicy food. I love curries. And I say, obviously with curries, a lot of time you have the rice. I'll actually have curry with a wholemeal pasta, because the white rice spites me. I don't particularly like the brown rice. So I'll think, well, I'll have a wholemeal pasta, but it's smaller portions, so it's a lot more. It's like if I had a chicken curry, I had a lot more chicken and veg in it, and not so much sauce, because a lot of the sauces are quite high in glucose as well. So it's just smaller portions, but more protein and more veg, and smaller rice portions. And I actually cook curries from scratch now, which I never used to do.
We'll have to share some recipes, I think. Tell you my mum's recipes.
Oh, yeah, please.
What about you, Johnny? In terms of your favourite food, have you got any tips for the people watching as to how you can navigate that whilst keeping an eye on your diabetes?
Yeah, so I think first and foremost, having the sensor, it is a bit of a safety net, like Mark was saying. So I think you can enjoy most foods. I think my favourite sweet food, I've got such a sweet tooth, it would be a cheesecake. I absolutely love a cheesecake. New York cheesecake, brilliant. But I think an actual meal, anything with steak in. I love steak. You can cook it in so many ways. It's so versatile. You can put it with chips. You can put it with salad. You can put it with just veg. So I think for me, I love steak, and it's such a versatile food. You can pair it with just about anything, and within that you'll find a good way to manage your glucose reading. So it would help if you like steak.
I love steak.
Yeah.
God, you two have got my mouth watering, I'm telling you. But it's not only about what you eat, is it, Mark? There's also the how you eat, portion control, or I like to call it portion awareness, mindfulness, eating slowly. Share a little bit about that.
So there's actually some science behind this. So consider this: you go to a restaurant and it's quite fancy, and the food comes out, and you think, "Where's the rest of it?" And it's because they tend to give you smaller portions. But then, just the nature of being in the restaurant, you have to sit there, you talk, you're waiting for the check to come, and as you leave, and I don't know if anyone will resonate with this, you say, "I tell you what, that was just the right amount of food, actually." And it's because it takes about 15 minutes for your hunger or your satiety or your feelings of fullness hormones to catch up. So sometimes just understanding the science behind it can help you understand that if I just give it 15, 20 minutes, even though it doesn't look like a huge amount of food on the plate, it will fill me up. And if it doesn't, you can always go back for more then. But what we do at home is we load up the plate, we shove it down, or we go back for seconds before the hormones have caught up. And then you're like, put a fork in me, I'm done, I'm absolutely stuffed. So sometimes that can just trigger people's minds to think, you know what, I'll just wait a little while. And it's a cliche, but it's true.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Even things like just put your cutlery down, have a sip of water, enjoy the social aspect of food, and it gives your stomach time to tell your brain, I think you've had enough now.
Literally.
And you enjoy it more. Well, I do.
Enjoy it. Savor it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about enjoyment of food. Have you got any other tips on how you eat that would be useful here?
No. I find if I eat more regularly, that's better for me. I'm not very good at doing that. As I'm retired, I eat when I'm hungry and I sleep when I'm tired. But if I eat regular times, I find my glucose levels are much better. And not sort of like, have your breakfast, have your lunch, have your tea. And as long as I'm sort of eating before 7, then it's not too bad. Before I go to bed, my glucose levels have dropped back down again and that. But type spread the food out through the day in smaller portions.
I suppose the risk then as well is if you've missed meals, then you load it up in the evening, and then that's when the glucose spikes can come, and then that's when the headaches begin.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think she's a prize patient, though, isn't she?
She
Because
is, yeah.
that's what we want. We want people to eat regular meals, regular snacks, enjoy your food, but look at the portion size, and you're doing it all. It's great.
I try. I try.
Well, let's take a look at some more questions from you, our lovely audience. So I've got one here from Mark. What's the difference in food nutrition labelling of carbs versus sugars?
Well, this can catch some people out, actually, because you'll have the traffic light system, red, amber, green. I'm sure everyone knows how traffic lights work. But what that will be in reference to will just be the sugar. And sugar is a type of carbohydrate, but there's lots of other different types of carbohydrates, starch being one. So that won't refer to the overall carb content. It won't refer to the GI of the food. So something could be green label, but still very high GI, still very carby. And so it could still affect the glucose levels quite significantly. But it does mean that for sugar, fat, salt, it's actually quite a low food if it's in the green zone. So it's just going that little bit extra, that one step further to investigate how it might affect your glucose levels, looking at the carbs, looking at the GI if you've got the resources available.
Right, so it's a bit of manipulation and test it and see.
A little bit, but I mean,
Yeah.
you can also see the carbs. You'll have the carbohydrate content on the label, and then you'll have the of which sugars. The of which sugars will feed into the carbs. It will be combined. So the total carbs is generally what you're interested in, but the sugar might give you an indication about, well, obviously how sugary it is, but also how quickly that food might be absorbed.
Right. Just a question for you, Johnny. What is the best thing to eat for breakfast?
Ooh. I sometimes miss breakfast. I'm a uni student, so I'm often leap out of bed at 9 o'clock and I'm in the car. I'm driving to uni from a lecture at 8:30. But I think my favourite breakfast I found is just bacon, sausages and egg. And it's actually very interesting because although there's not a lot of carbs in it, it can still spike me. So I think adjusting insulin and making sure that my management strategies are in place, it's not always just about how many carbs are in something. It's about how you're managing what you are eating, your protein, your fats and things. But for me, definitely bacon, sausages and egg.
Wow. Just the last question for this section for you, Mark. Why will the same foods and portions impact you differently at different times?
Well, a lot of that, there's a lot of factors here, but let's just pick up on two of them. So some of them will be in relation to the hormones in your body. So for example, when it's early morning, you've got more cortisol, more growth hormone. These are the hormones that get you out of bed. So some of you might see a rise in your glucose levels, despite the fact all you've done is wake up.
Yeah.
So you're more prone to a spike in the morning. The other thing that might impact it is obviously if you're particularly active during the day, obviously you're burning up glucose, burning up energy throughout the day. So then you might be less prone to a spike in the evening. So there's lots of different factors that might feed into it. And I know it can be frustrating, but ultimately it's just getting to learn yourself. And if you can do that, then you can manage it the best way that you can.
Great, thank you, Mark. And now we're into our third and final part where I'm going to be showing you 3 different types of foods and explaining why perhaps how we can debunk some of those food myths. There are some common myths in diabetes. So for example, here I've got, some white toast, butter and jam, or maybe you might have a low-fat spread and a reduced sugar jam. So obviously that's going to have a certain effect on your blood glucose. But if you swap that for a granary toast and peanut butter. Here's one of the myths. A lot of people say to me, peanuts? You can't eat peanuts. They're just so fattening. And of course, yes, they are. In fact, if you took a peanut and split it into 2, half of it, roughly half of the weight, is fat, but it's the good type of fat. So you want to be thinking about those healthier fats that reduce your blood cholesterol. So a better choice, certainly, would be to use peanut butter, say the amount that a golf ball amount onto your bread, and that will give you a slower, steadier rise, or a handful of peanuts would do the same. Moving on, I call this my apple experiment. So, for example, this is an apple that's been squeezed. If I squeeze this apple, you'd roughly get this amount of apple juice. And if I were to say to Jenny, you start eating this apple at the same time that Johnny starts to drink this juice, which is the same amount of juice that would come from an apple, who would finish first? Obviously, it's going to be Johnny. And the reason for that is here you've got the same amount of sugar, but in a liquid form. And that's going to be much more quickly digested. It's going to get straight into your bloodstream and cause those high blood glucose levels. Whereas with the apple, the same amount of carbohydrate, you've got the fiber, and your body's having to do all the work. You're chewing it, your gut's going to have to break it down. And I always say to people that think about choosing foods where your body's got to do the work and not the manufacturer. Think of having whole foods where you're working a little bit harder. And here's another example of one of my philosophies, which is an eat more, which might sound very counterintuitive. But actually, if you eat more vegetables and get it, a bit like Jenny was saying, get into the habit of adding more veg, not only are you adding nutrients and fiber, but you're helping that glycemic impact. So here I've got some al dente pasta. Obviously, the more al dente it is, the slower that rise in your blood glucose. And if, for example, I put in some chopped red pepper, which is a very low GI food, you're actually now lowering the glycemic impact of this whole meal. And if you have one low GI meal, the effect of it can last you right through to the next meal. So you might, for example, add lentils to a stew or a curry, and that way again, you're adding more veg, which is a nice positive thing to do to your food, but you're also going to be lowering those spikes and making sure you're having slow, steady glucose levels. So I don't know, Mark, whether you've got some swaps that you can add to that.
Yes, well, I think they're very good swaps in the first instance. Some things as well, it could be really easy. Perhaps like if Jenny, you're not a big fan of the brown rice, perhaps you can do 50-50 mixtures. So maybe you do the white rice and put some cauliflower rice in with it, for example. Or if you're doing pasta, you do the pasta with the courgette. If you're finding that cereal spikes your glucose levels, perhaps migrate to something like porridge or overnight oats, because they're lower GI, and particularly with the overnight oats, if you're not cooking the porridge oats and it's bound in the yogurt and you keep putting it in the fridge overnight, then of course it's going to be lower GI and you're less likely to get a spike.
Wonderful, thank you for that. And I'm wondering, Johnny, whether you've used any of those swaps or you have some of your own?
Yeah, so I love cereal. My favourite were probably some sort of frosted flake. I love them, so sugary and sweet. But the other day, I actually found a lovely low sugar granola, and I tried to pair that with some yogurt, and it's done wonders for my sugars. And that's probably a bit of an adventurous swap for me, really, because I'd normally just have me bacon, sausages and egg. But I found that actually it's really tasty as well. And because it's low sugar, it's not having that big, massive spike in the morning like other cereals are.
Yeah, really good. And it's going to give them fibre. It's going to give them the soluble fibre, which again helps to lower your cholesterol. So that sounds like a pretty good choice. Mm-hmm. Wonderful. What about you? Do you have any swaps that you find really help you?
I used to like cereals as well. And again, I've swapped for Greek yogurts. Full fat ones I find are better than the low fat ones. With granolas, sugar-free granola I got, and I quite like putting some berries in with it as well, so it gives it that little sweetness. But I like eggs on toast and things like that as well for breakfast. But mainly I've swapped from the cereals to the yogurts and the granolas. And
yeah.
Okay, and in the winter, porridge. I do eat porridge in the winter.
Mm.
So
porridge is one of those. Do you remember the research on glycemic index? And the first few studies were on porridge and cornflakes, and how porridge gives you a nice slow steady rise, whereas cornflakes just go straight through.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that you also mentioned that you found that helpful.
Yeah. So I very rarely ate porridge before, and I'd read somewhere porridge was like you said, it's a slower release, and I said, and I like it anyway. So yeah, I've swapped that for cereals.
Yeah.
Yeah. Don't very often have cereals now. Very rare.
But again, you're choosing food that you love.
Yes.
And that's really lovely to hear from all of you, you know, that we're celebrating food today.
Yeah.
And maybe I can come to you, Mark. What sort of small changes have your patients made that you think have a big impact?
Well, I think the one that we've already addressed, and probably the easiest one to do, path of least resistance, is from high GI to low GI. And what we find is if you do that, you will lower your HbA1c, your average glucose levels, for those that aren't aware of that, by about 8 millimoles per mole, or if you work in old money, about just under 1%. There's 11 millimoles per mole per 1%. So a significant change. It's not going to be the difference between sky high sugars and in range or where your nurse might want them, but it's going to be significant. But, looking beyond just glucose, kind of what Jenny's been doing. If you looked at, say, like a spaghetti bolognese, if you went from full fat mince to 5% mince, if you went to 50% courgette mixed in with the pasta, if you changed the cheese from full fat to 50% fat in your sandwich, if you took out the cheese and put some fresh salad in, you changed the mayo from full fat mayo to lighter than light mayo, I've just saved you about 500-600 calories in a day, and I've not really changed a huge amount. So if we're looking at a wider picture, particularly in type 2 diabetes, where we know probably the best treatment is weight loss, that can make a huge difference. And really, I've not changed a great deal. And just in case anyone's thinking it, the flavor's gone. It's not that bad, and the taste buds will adapt quite quickly.
Interesting. So you're still eating the same basic foods, aren't you? But just being very mindful of portion size and small sort of changes. And you're right. You can make that food tasty, adding lemon juice, chilies. You love your chilies, don't you? So
I do,
it's a great thing to add.
Yeah, and like you were saying about the mince, I've always added grated carrot to my mincemeat because it makes it go further. And you don't, when times were hard when I was younger, you put carrot in with it. It was cheaper to feed the whole family. And I've continued to do that.
Exactly that. Sometimes it's even just the distribution of food on the plate. A little bit less meat, a bit more veg.
Yeah.
And that will take you a long way as well.
Yeah. Lovely idea of the carrots, actually. You don't even realise.
No, you don't realise it's in there. I used to
get.
it's where I've gotten vegetables into my children when they were younger, when they didn't want them.
Yeah,
hide
sneak
in the
them.
mince.
Yes, I need to steal this one from you, Jenny.
What about you, Johnny? Is there a food swap that's really brought back that love of food? One of your, what you really enjoy eating?
Yeah, I had broccoli to my spaghetti bolognese. I'd cut up like broccoli florets and add them. I boil them with the pasta, with the edamame pasta. And then when it's in with the sauce and things, you can't tell. No. The other thing I really, really do enjoy is onion. I add 2 to my spaghetti bolognese, a nice red onion. It's lovely. I grow them at home myself because I love them that much.
Fascinating that you grow your own. I mean, that's a beautiful way to really understand food and enjoy it. I'm sure it tastes much better than supermarket
yes.
I want to hear a bit more about your sort of favourite foods and how you manage to incorporate them, and maybe even when it comes to eating out. So the same principles we've discussed can be applied even when we're not at home. So whether dining out or at someone else's place or whatever, eating out needn't mean you can't. It's not that you can't eat out. So do you have any tips on how you manage that?
I always look for smaller portions. Let's say, because like you said, you give your body time to catch up. You do feel full. I would leave if they didn't have like sweet potato and it was ordinary chips. I would leave half the chips in that, but I don't deprive myself of anything. I have everything, but very in moderation, in smaller portions. So I don't find it difficult to eat out. I still go out sometimes for a carvery or a roast, and I still have a roast potato. I don't have so many. I still do have everything, but I limit the portion sizes. And more vegetables. I quite often eat vegetarian food now when I'm out, which I never used to do. No. But I find that very tasty.
Great. So you've not let your diabetes at all get in the way of you eating out and enjoying your food?
No.
Great.
As I said, my son's a type 1 diabetic, and I always remember the health visitor said to him, "You control it, don't let it control you." And that's something I've always lived by. When he was younger, he was as young when he still went to parties. He still had a piece of cake because he had to be in control, not it controlling him. So you could still eat anything you wanted, but do it in moderation.
Lovely. I'm sure you've given him a lot of lovely lessons for life there. Beautiful. Maybe I can come to you, Mark, a little bit more about eating out. How would you suggest people make mindful choices when they're eating out?
I suppose there's 2 ways of looking at it. I suppose, the steamed fish, the vegetables and the new potatoes is always going to be on the menu. But in reality, probably most people want the burger and chips. So, and I suppose that's just being realistic. So a lot of the menus will print the calories on the menu these days. Where there's calories, there's usually carbs. Where there's carbs, there's usually potential for glucose spikes. But in reality, just remember, we're not trying for perfection here. So we only need about 70% time in range to prevent any additional risk of complications from diabetes longer term. So well off needing perfection. So if you go out and have a meal every now and then and it causes a glucose spike, it's not the end of the world. We can fix it later. Glucose levels will settle. So in one sense, you can have your cake and eat it to a certain degree. Obviously, if you're doing it 5 times a week, that's a different story. But that's not unique to diabetes. That's overall healthy eating. And so, it's more about overall dietary patterns.
Wonderful. And I don't know if you've got any quick tips on eating out.
Yeah, so if I was eating out at a restaurant, if I was having steak and chips, I would probably have a steak and a salad, but then I'd have a New York cheesecake, for example, afterwards. So I'm sort of giving up one thing, but then I'm enjoying the food ultimately, because I enjoy a nice salad as long as it's a nice salad and a nice steak. And then afterwards, I still get to enjoy a lovely dessert rather than just sort of adding on more things, because I don't find it a sacrifice, because I don't enjoy the chips as much as I would enjoy the steak and the salad, for example.
Wonderful. Well, let's go to some questions from you, our lovely audience. Mark, maybe I can come to you first. Can your body get used to food and exercise and your blood sugar starts to rise regardless? Is there a way to control this without medication?
Well, perhaps you can help me out as well. I'm not aware of any research to say your body adapts to food, but it certainly adapts to exercise.
Yeah.
So as you get fitter, what used to be hard will become easier, and therefore the afterburn will not be as great. So if before you found that the exercise you were doing was helping to keep the glucose levels in range, actually as you get fitter, you might find that the glucose levels then have a tendency to start to drift because your body's not having to work as hard to get back to normal.
Great to exercise then, isn't it? So many fronts, really useful. Thank you. Maybe I can come to Johnny now. What's the best lower calorie food for treating hypos? This was someone who lives with type 1 diabetes asking this.
I mean, I'm not too aware of the calories, but I treat a lot of my hypos with fruit. So banana, that can sort of get my sugars up quite quickly. An apple or a plum. There, I tend to treat my low sugars with fruit, but I'm not too sure. You guys might be able to help me out with the sort of calories and that.
Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I suppose the issue is because the hypo treatment is going to be around 15 to 20 grams of quick-acting carbohydrate, that the calories are going to be there. So they're all going to be about the same calories, roughly 60 calories. I guess where people might find themselves falling down slightly is if they can't get out of the hypo, so they have to have more, or they overtreat the hypo. Because a bit like the gut hormones, even if you take 15 grams of carbs or 6 tons of carbs to treat the hypo, it's still going to take about 15 minutes to get into your system. But obviously not having diabetes myself, I imagine it's quite difficult to just sit on your hands and wait to see if it actually comes back up or not. So I suppose there's a tendency to overtreat. But no, unfortunately, if it's low calorie or lower calories than the other hypo treatments, it's probably not got the sufficient sugar to get you back.
Right. Okay, wonderful. And Jenny, this one might be for you. I don't know if you've found that the order in which you eat food has an effect on your blood glucose levels. Do you ever manipulate that and see that it has a difference, makes a difference?
No, I don't think I haven't changed the order in which I eat my food, so no, I don't.
Yeah.
I don't know.
And there's no real science behind that, really, is there, Mark? It's more about proportions, and eating slowly and mindfully, and
Exactly. Back to the basics.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
And it can be a bit miserable if you sat there, literally thinking about what order you're going to eat your food and your veg, and you have the chicken first. Oh, now it's on now. Now I have the pasta. Food's there to be enjoyed. We want it. The flavor comes with mixing the foods, releasing the flavors, and ultimately, if you're mixing the food anyway, it's all going to get mashed up in your belly. And the glycemic index of that food is going to be lower if you have foods that are a combination, protein, fat, fiber, than if you have just say, straight up sugar or something like that. So, you're naturally doing it anyway.
Okay. And Johnny, here's one for you. How does alcohol impact your blood sugars?
Yeah, so alcohol can make me go really quite low in the night, and I think you'll probably be able to say that's a universal thing, isn't it, Mark, with alcohol? So I think obviously it stops your liver from producing glucose and releasing it. So I think depending on what alcohol, if I was to have a sugary drink, a cocktail that had more sugar and a bit less alcohol, I would tend to sort of stay level. But if I was going for spirits, which I tend to do, which are obviously much higher in alcohol content, they tend to knock me quite low. So I have a snack before I go to bed if I've had alcohol.
Very useful. Okay, and there's one that I think I can answer because I was talking about the peanut butter. Are salted nuts so much worse than unsalted from a diabetic point of view? Well, we know from research, and I hope you'll agree, that a handful of nuts as part of a healthy diet does help to lower your blood cholesterol. It can also help you manage your weight. But of course, we want to watch the salt. Now, thank you for the question, because people with diabetes are more prone to heart conditions, which includes things like high blood pressure and stroke. And therefore, we want to be watching the amount of salt we have, because the sodium in salt will raise your blood pressure. So, yeah, thank you for that question. Better to have the unsalted nuts, and that way you're having the best of both worlds. So we've got another one here for you, Mark. Cider vinegar seems to be the new thing to stop or reduce blood sugar spikes. Is this true, and does it actually work?
I think usually when it sounds too good to be true, it usually is. So if unfortunately, the quick wins don't tend to be based on science particularly much. Even if there is something to it, rarely is it the difference between getting the glucose levels to where you want to be, getting your health where you want it to be. Actually, again, it's just back to building those foundations. You need solid foundations, which is the portion control, the right distribution of nutrients, getting your 5 a day, being active. And if you do that, although that's fairly difficult for a lot of people, you're going to be in a very good position. Whereas if you're not doing that and take a little apple cider vinegar or take a supplement, it's probably not going to be the difference.
And if I can just stick with you for a minute, which bread is better? And you'll have found different breads obviously affect your blood glucose, and I have a view on this, but wholemeal, rye or sourdough?
Ooh, well, actually, I'd be very interested to see what the guys think and what you think, because, I wouldn't know off the top of my head which actually has the lowest glycemic index value. So perhaps you can help me out, actually, because you said you have a view.
Yeah, well, rye and sourdough would be the lowest. And it's really interesting that the acid in sourdough is what's doing the trick. It's that fermentation. So sourdough, although it's even white, doesn't seem to give, obviously you're the experts in terms of what it does in the body, but it doesn't seem to give you that spike, and it is a lower GI, as is rye bread. Interestingly, wholemeal bread has the same glycemic index as white bread, and a lot of people are surprised with that.
Yeah.
It's obviously better in terms of fibre and B vitamins, but because the manufacturer, again, has mushed up all those wheat grains, it's going to do the same, it's going to give you that same spike as white bread does. And that's why the granary bread was...
Yeah,
was
that's it. I
the one
tend to
of
have
choice
granary
there.
bread. Occasionally I have rye bread. Never tried sourdough bread, but
A little bit of homework.
yeah, I'll have to try that now.
What's your favourite?
Yeah, so I tend to avoid white bread. When I was eating brown bread on my whole food diet, I did find it did make a difference, and it didn't make me go as high, but the level was it was a very stable level. Whereas if I was eating white bread, I might go up a bit and then come back down and then go back up. Whereas if I had wholemeal bread, it did keep me at a stable level.
And what were you putting on the wholemeal bread?
I think actually it was peanut butter.
There you go.
There we are.
So it was that's really interesting. So it was what you teamed it up with that made the big difference, because
Yeah.
wholemeal bread is going to give you that spike. But that's really interesting. And you can do that with avocado, other sorts of foods that you can put onto there, which would be really useful. So Mark, we've got another one here. Why do I spike when I do exercise, even several hours after a meal? This is a person who has type 2 diabetes.
I guess, well, obviously we can't see what the glucose levels are actually doing without getting a view on them, but there is a type of exercise that causes glucose levels to spike. That tends to be a more high intensity exercise. And that doesn't necessarily mean you have to be doing burpees or, running up hills. It has to be high intensity for you. And the reason is it's stressful for your body. So your body's releasing cortisol, which makes you release glucose. So it's pumping a bunch of sugar into your system, and therefore you will get a spike, which can stay elevated for quite a while, but usually drops down later. Whereas more slow, steady exercise like walking or jogging, more aerobic, cardio-based exercise is the type of exercise that tends to drop the glucose levels more gradually. But obviously there might be individual nuances with this person where, perhaps they're just eating something, maybe low GI, a few hours before that actually is leading into the session. So it's hard to say exactly, but there is some science there.
Great. And it's about context, as you've said. You can't really answer a question in isolation. You've got to look at what else is going on. One, if I may, just before we finish, Jenny, with you, some ideas for snacks. What would you suggest would be a healthy snack? We've got a suggestion of ice cream. How does that react when you have ice cream, for example?
Not so good.
Right.
Quite high with ice cream. Snacks, I tend to eat more savoury snacks. Nuts. I eat quite a lot of unsalted nuts, mixed nuts. I eat a lot of cucumber, carrot sticks, celery. I love celery. And I've heard that you use more energy eating it than you do. So I tend to go for savoury snacks rather than sweet snacks. If I fancy something sweet, I might have a plain digestive biscuit. And I don't find that spices me too much. But you've got to stick at the one.
Yeah, and that works for you.
Yeah.
Great. I actually think I've got time for one more. Mark, does freezing and then thawing food help reduce GI?
Ooh. It can, in theory, yes. And actually, to take that one step further as well, so even just refrigerating can make a big difference. So if you put your pasta in the fridge, you'll see it all binds together. When you try and take it out the tub, it just blonks out. Yeah. So actually, you're getting a lot more resistant starch there. Same happens with potatoes and lots of other carbohydrate-based foods. So yes, if you're cooling down the food after you've eaten it, it's not to say then you can only have a spaghetti bolognese in the future where you've got reheated pasta, but it does make a difference. So yes, the way you're preparing, the way you're storing food can make a difference to that GI.
Yeah, you remind me of that research. Did you read about it? That if you put white bread in the freezer and then you toast it directly from the freezer, you're going to get a really nice slow glucose curve. So for those people who really love their white bread, and
try that.
There you go.
I think Johnny's eyes lighting up.
Maybe add the peanut butter too. But actually it doesn't give you the same impact as if you'd had the white bread as it is at room temperature.
Right.
So if it's frozen, and it's because of what Mark's just said, it improves the resistant starch, and resistant starch is more slowly digested. So there's a new tip for you.
Yeah.
I'll give you that one for free. So I'm so sorry. An hour has gone by. Can you believe it? That's all we have time for today. A huge thank you to our amazing panel. Mark, thank you. Jenny, thank you. And Johnny, thank you so much for sharing your insights, your expertise, your personal experiences, your advice. And thanks, of course, to all of you for joining us and contributing your questions. It's been so fantastic to see so many people coming together, talking about food and diabetes, and how you've asked so many questions. Thank you for that. We've learned so much tonight. And I hope you've taken away some things that might work for you. I think we've all been reminded that food is there to be enjoyed. It's pleasurable. It gives you an emotional benefit. There are social aspects to food. I would have loved to have asked you a bit more about that, but just ran out of time. But all that is just as important as nutritional value. So one last question before we go off air. I'd like to ask each of you maybe one takeaway, one insight that you've got from tonight that's been quite impactful for you. What have you felt you've taken away? Maybe I'll start with you, Johnny.
I think the glycaemic index and versus the glycemic load has just been the thing that's just unlocked a lot of knowledge for me today, having that advice from yourself.
Wonderful. Pat on the back to you, Mark.
Thank you.
And maybe I'll come to you then. What's been the one?
I think for me, it's actually just hearing Johnny and Jenny's experiences, and that you can do it. Like it's there for the taking, and it doesn't have to be necessarily a complete overhaul. With subtle changes can make a big difference, and if they can do it, you can do it. So that's probably my biggest learning.
Lovely. And Jenny?
Well, the last thing about the pasta, leaving things in the fridge, cooking bread from frozen, that's something I had heard about having things al dente. That was better, but that's something I should be trying. Pre-cooking it and putting it in the fridge or in the freezer.
Let us know how you get on with that.
Yeah.
I guess for me, what really warmed my heart was when you talked about your son with type 1 diabetes, and just how you have been such an amazing role model for him, and how I really believe you have empowered him through your own experiences. You've not been overpowering, you've not been on top of him. and you've just shared your experiences, your learning. And I think that's a beautiful, beautiful insight that you've given me in terms of you're all role models, really, you are. And you're role models to today's audience. The way you've shared, there will be people out there who think, God, I can do that. I didn't think about that. So thank you so much for sharing all your wonderful expertise and insights. We hope you've enjoyed the event. I certainly have. Take care, and we'll see you next time.